Yeah, philosophically speaking, tonight I want to talk about current politics and things in that are always the general political discussion, like racism and systemic racism. Uh, yeah, um, but I've stumbled across an interesting philosophical idea, what I call Collins Criterion. Um, like to distinguish between, to actually identify a circular argument. And I would, straight off the bat, I'd say Collins' criterion is to say a circular argument, well, whether something exists or not, or is a thing, so to speak, or is even a relevant way of looking at phenomena. This interesting question to ask is, um, is it a cause or an effect? Now, there's a lot of things at the moment in political discourse, like global warming or systematic racism, or its previous Marxist incarnation was elitism, capitalist elitism, where and class consciousness, and but I mean, yeah, I mean, the Marxists in the 20th century just refashioned Marxism into, like, you know, they just reinvented class hatred as gender hatred. I mean, gender competition, gender dominance, gender exploitation, and whatever. And they also invented the whole. They also just refashioned the idea of class consciousness as race consciousness. I mean, it's a really obvious kind of thing to do if you're trying to start a fight. But it's what they do. But I mean, so anyway, now, like for example, is evolution? I'm talking about evolution because it's relevant, because Karl Marx, of all people, decided to base his sociological theories on Darwinism, and so he had this idea of, which he got from Polybius actually, but this idea of history being a petri dish, where systems, economic philosophies, struggle and compete for in the world, and so that was the whole thing during the years of the Soviet Union. Was you had people like Khrushchev. I mean, Khrushchev's famous for banging the table with his shoe and shouting, "We will bury you," and that's often been mistranslated to mean "we'll kill you." But what I mean is, obviously, I mean, well, not obvious. The things like, well, evolution. I mean, evolution is a good example. Uh, I mean, evolution claims to be, proven by the facts of paleobiology, or just which is just geological discoverings and just geological musings about long dead fossil creatures. And for example, Darwinist evolution purportedly offers an explanation for how these things came to be. Now, I mean, you could say, well, it's a lot like, I mean, it's a lot. It's a bit like reincarnation and karma. But at any point, the point is, evolution. Is evolution a cause or an effect? And that's not a clear question to answer. Because it's taken as just a fact, or something that is taken, as a fact, an undeniable, unquestionable fact. But I mean, people always say, well, evolution, and they talk about one creature, long dead creature from a fossil record, resembling or not resembling a living creature. Now, as this state of affairs taken to be as an effect of evolution, but people always talk about evolution as though it's just a principle of the universe, some kind of cosmic principle of the universe that's going to be there, as the internal fabric of the universe, and so evolution is a primal sort of cause of the state of the affairs in the world we live in, and so the things we see are effects of evolution. And how did European intellectuals get that way? How do you say, what's the proof of evolution? And they say, well, look, the fossil record, which is an effect of evolution, purportedly. But I mean, that's a first order logical fallacy, which was never mentioned to me in high school. I don't remember. And I mean, now, and people say, well, what's the cause of evolution? Well, cause of evolution is selective breeding. Selective breeding, which survival of the fittest by selective breeding, which arises from random chance. In the struggle for life. But I mean, one thing random chance is not at all is a cause. Okay. I mean, it's like it's like 1,000 things. You sit down, you go to a cafeteria in your school or college, and they say, "Well, why do they have fish today?" It's on the menu. Who made it on the menu? It just happened that way. It's random chance. So, and why do we have, pineapples on Wednesdays? Somebody thought it'd be a good idea on to put it on the timetable, and it's random chance. That's how it's turned out. So, so don't blame anybody. It's random chance, and so random chance is invoked to abrogate accountability for decisions. Like this famous politician's trick, I would have done better in my term in office, but gee whiz, we had all these things happen. Coronavirus and bushfires and whatever. But yeah, random chance is used to, as I say, to negate responsibility. Okay, so one of the foundation stones of Darwinist thinking, isn't a cause. It explains, effects, random. It's just randomness which explains effects. So there's no cause for effects. Well, this brings me to systemic racism. Now, it's the old black versus white thing that's it's always been, it's in the whole Black Lives Matter rioting in the US. There's this whole discussion, this whole meta theory about systemic racism and white supremacism. I mean, it even made its way into the presidential debates recently between Biden and Trump. And Biden vehemently accused Trump of not disavowing white supremacism. Now, I mean, there's this whole meta theory behind it, is that it's obvious that systemic racism in America exists. And that's actually a lot harder to establish than it looks. I mean, yes, there are different races in America. There's identifiably, white people from European extraction, and there's people from African extraction, there's Asian extraction, there's natives, and there's lots of Hispanics. Now, the fact that there's genetic racial diversity that's not an evidence of systemic racism. In places in the world, like in Europe, formerly, where you had like a fairly, or even like lots of places in the world, like China or Japan, where you have racially homogenous societies, it's harder to talk about systemic racism, because people aren't obviously different looking to others. But to a lot of people, it seems that the fact that there's different races means there's necessarily systemic racism, but that doesn't hold at all. That's a logical fallacy. But I mean, the 20th century has been this whole discussion, especially about the black versus white thing that's going on. Yeah, well, it hasn't been that easy for black, well, I wouldn't call them academics. Well, there's some, sociological types and lawyers and journalists who take it as just as granted, an obvious, self-evident truth that America is a racist society. Um, and but looking for data is a lot harder. I mean, there's the usual. I mean, there's the argument from statistics. Has been what I've noticed has been going on all my life. I've noticed, and it started off. People used to talk about. Well, I mean, underprivileged black people in America were statistically poor, and invent some kind of metric of poverty or metric of privilege, and whether that's just wages or education or whatever. And people have been saying that black people are, underprivileged. They've been saying that for decades. And the statistics show that, and yeah, but it's a tough question. Why is somebody richer than someone else? Why is somebody poorer than someone else? Yeah, it blurs. It quickly blurs into, choice of lifestyle, different aspirations. I mean, the thing was, people trying to regard society as some kind of deterministic machine that's going to produce outcomes, and human volition is very much responsible in the way people's lives turns out. It has to be admitted. I mean, human free will is very much an important factor in the way people's lives turn out, and you can't blame the system for that. That's more difficult, and but yeah, well, they talk about how blacks have been victimized, and they usually point to how like the black population is, the argument used to go, blacks are 10% of the population, they're 30-40% of the prison population, they're being picked on, and blacks are being framed and convicted in kangaroo courts and rushed to jail, and no, police corruption exists, and black people aren't the only victims of miscarriages of justice. Well, the point is that if you look at the statistics, which is the statistics that black people like to quote, there's more blacks in jail as a proportion of the population as compared to their general proportion. Their proportion of the general population. Now, prima facie, one will look at a statistic like that and say, well, this community, this subgroup of the community, is more prone to crime. But that's pretty much verboten. I mean, they'll scream and howl about racism and racial stereotypes and all the things about why blacks end up in jail and end up in prison. They don't have any money. They can't afford lawyers. White juries are prejudiced against black defendants, and the whole panoply of arguments. Now, but the facts are, we've also been hearing since, there's always people who want to legalize drugs, liberalize drug laws, and legalize marijuana, for example. And they're always talking about how, like, since the 80s at least, since the Republicans' war on drugs, the prisons, they've got people being given long jail sentences for non-violent crimes. And the inference, the accusation is that this is a prison industrial state which imprisons and enslaves non-violent offenders for imaginary crimes. And now I heard a lot of that growing up. And yeah, I mean, now it turns out in America, about 50% of actual prisoners are in prison for drug trafficking. And they don't tend to throw people in jail for just casual drug use. And the people who get thrown in jail are people who've been convicted of drug smuggling. Now, there's other non-violent crimes other than drug smuggling. There's, theft and embezzlement and there's all these sort of non-violent, maybe you hear the term white collar crimes, counterfeiting and tax evasion and whatnot. So I mean, added to if you take away 50% of the prison population who are in jail for drug smuggling, there's certainly another considerable proportion of people who are in prison for just white collar crimes and as they say, but I would contest that there's also a lot of violent people who end up in jail, who've wound up in jail because of drugs, one way or another. And there's the classic addict who steals to pay for his habit, or the crack addicted guy who holds up a convenience store trying to get money, drug addicts can certainly embezzle and pilfer and steal things from their employers and from and others. But the point is, a lot of people are actually in prison for violent crimes related to drugs. I mean, and alcohol. They've got into fights, brawling, and drunkenness and general intoxication and driving under the influence of alcohol or drugs, and those sorts of things. I mean, there's I mean, in fact, my point is there's a large proportion of people in prison who are there for, say, violent crimes or even non-violent crimes, inevitably, inextricably bound up with drug abuse. And so these, along with the cohort who are just simply in prison for drug smuggling, I mean, you could say a clear majority of people in prison are in prison for drugs. Now, yeah, so I mean, so the majority of prisoners in the United States, at least, and it's similar in Australia and Canada. I mean, the majority of prisoners are actually people who got there because of drugs and alcohol somehow. Now, what's the point? The point is people are saying, well, the black community is overrepresented in the prison population. Now, yeah, they look up the stats about 30% of the U.S. prison population is black. About 30% is white. About 30% is Hispanic. Now, the point being is if you're in jail, you've got a good chance of being there because of drugs.